Charles Mills was one of the most foremost critics of John Rawls. And specifically in his article, Ideal Theory as Ideology, he not only criticizes the kind of methodology that Rawls employs, but the whole notion of ideal theorizing in general, arguing that really what ideal theory does is obfuscate the real injustices that occur in society and end up perpetuating them. Ideal theorizing in general, asks, what would a perfectly just society be like? Right? It's the basic kind of utopian question. What is the ideal society? Ideal theory in general is going to try to derive or create those principles which would constitute this ideal society, for all. But it's John Rawls who makes this methodological distinction between what he calls ideal theory and non-ideal theory. Now, ideal theory basically assumes strict compliance or full compliance of the principles of justice, whatever those principles may be. Non-ideal theory, on the other hand, assumes only partial compliance. The fact that, well, actually, not everybody, adheres to whatever those principles of justice might be. And so how do we deal with that, right? How do we best realize then the principles of justice, achieving, the society that ideal theory sets out principles of justice to enable? So ideal theory and non-ideal theory are related insofar as ideal theory basically serves as the foundation for the more practical non-ideal theory. So ideal theory conceives basically the ends within the limits of practical possibility, and non-ideal theory conceives the how in order to realize the end. Some examples of this are like John Rawls and his methodology of the original position and the choosing of the two principles of justice, of Robert Nozick and his idea of historical principles of justice. Why might Nozick, for example, be an ideal theorist? Well, basically he says justice occurs when you have these conditions of basically appropriation of property, transferring of property, and rectification of property unjustly transferred. And there's no real kind of baked into it a way of how to deal with injustice or the fact that there is injustice. Kant, similar reasons, as to Rawls and so on. So what Mills does is distinguish three different basically models or three different kinds of idealizing that occurs in philosophy. Now, he says all theory is ideal in the sense that it involves some abstraction. And even a kind of like anti-utopian political philosophy can't help but abstract insofar as basically, well, to make sense of anything in the world at all, you're going to be representing that phenomenon of the world. So if I want to talk about a tree out there, well, of course, I'm talking about a thing that can be applied to many different things we call trees. So what I've done is I've abstracted away from all the particular differences among what we call trees to this idea of a tree of which all of them maybe are derivative of or are part of the family of this concept of tree. So all theory is inevitably going to abstract. Mills calls this idealist descriptive models. All theory also, Mills says, is ideal in the sense that it involves appeal to values and ideals. So all theories kind of have this aspiration of, well, maybe equality is good, or justice is good, or we ought to pursue, something else, right? Whatever's an appeal to a kind of value that we might say is aspirational. So Mills calls that ideal as normative. So all theories abstract, and all theories appeal to values and ideals. What is it about ideal theory that is so problematic? Well, Mills says that ideal theories create ideal representations of representations. It basically creates an ideal of the representation of P, an ideal P, so to speak. Right? So if we say that a representation abstracts away certain features of P in order to create a representation, it's ideal theory that does this to create a kind of idealized, or maybe think of like a human being. We talk about human beings, this thing called a human being, even though there are different human beings, short, tall, with hair, without hair, whatever else, right? But think of, for example, Rawls's original position and the idea of the rational agent. For Mills, that's a kind of representation of the representation of a human being. It's an ideal representation. It says, well, this is how we ought to think of human beings. That's not how human beings actually are. So what it does is what ideal theory does, is it has to abstract away, to strip away, shave away the various features of that representation P, maybe human beings, in order to create some essential nature that it says, well, this is what we really care about in human beings, even if it's not reflective of human beings as they actually are. And Mills calls this ideal as idealized models. So it's not that ideal theory idealizes. It's not that it abstracts that makes it problematic. As we'll see, it's that it idealizes the abstraction. Ideal theory relies on idealization to the exclusion, or at least the marginalization of the actual. And there are 6 things that Mills says this results in. The first is an idealized social ontology. Mills says an idealized social ontology of the modern type, as against, say, a Platonic or Aristotelian type, will typically assume the abstract and undifferentiated equal atomic individuals of classical liberalism. Thus, it will abstract away from the relations of structural domination, exploitation, coercion, and oppression, which in reality, of course, will profoundly shape the ontology of those same individuals, locating them in superior and inferior positions in social hierarchies of various kinds. So just based on this idea of an idealized social ontology, well, if in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, you don't have individuals that are deliberating about principles of justice that are reflective of social ontology of the relations between persons as it actually exists, and which we say isn't entirely just, well then how are those individuals going to be able to agree upon principles of justice that are going to be able to address those injustices of which those individuals are representations of, because you've stripped away all of the things that are representative of actual injustice in society to create idealized moral agents that are meant to deliberate. So you've created an idealized social ontology of how human beings ought to be and how they ought to be then in theorizing about what justice is. Right? It's too far removed from the actual world. Now, second, ideal theory has idealized capacities. Mills says the human agents visualized in the theory will also often have completely unrealistic capacities attributed to them. Who would not have had an equal opportunity for their natural capacities to develop, and who would in fact typically be disabled in crucial aspects. So it's just the case that, say, in the original position, you're gonna have these, equal moral agents, rational agents, that are going to be, in a sense, more rational than human beings actually are. So who is it that's actually theorizing in the original position? Is it even human beings? You're also going to have silence on oppression. He says, almost by definition, it follows from the focus of ideal theory that little or nothing will be said on actual historical oppression and its legacy in the present or current ongoing oppression, though these may be gestured at in a vague or promissory way as something to be dealt with later by, of course, non-ideal theory, right? So someone that's maybe defending ideal theory might say, well, yeah, of course we're not going to be talking about actual historical oppression because that's what non-ideal theory is meant to deal with. And the only way non-ideal theory is going to know how to deal with this is by knowing that which it is aiming at, which is the ideal. And if you don't know what the ideal is, how can you be sure that you're addressing injustice in the correct way? But Mills's point here is that, well, actually, whatever principles of justice you're going to agree to, because you're not taking into account, you're not discussing actual historical oppression because that's been blocked by the veil of ignorance, well, you're not actually going to know what kind of principles of justice will be able to rectify injustice. Number 4, ideal social institutions. Mills says, fundamental social institutions, such as the family, the economic structure, the legal system, will therefore be conceptualized in ideal as idealized model terms, with little or no sense of how their actual workings may systematically disadvantage women, the poor, and racial minorities. Think about the idea of the rational agent, talking about economic institutions. Well, economic institutions don't really function in this kind of rational way. I mean, think about advertising, for example. Advertising works by appealing to people in non-rational or irrational ways to get them to buy products. Many times you have exploitation. You have people being taken advantage of when the market is based on maybe irrational forces. So it doesn't make sense to talk about the economic institutions that would be thought about in an ideal situation when that doesn't actually reflect the institutions as they actually exist. Number 5, an idealized cognitive sphere. A general social transparency will be presumed with cognitive obstacles minimized as limited to biases of self-interest or the intrinsic difficulties of understanding the world, and little or no attention paid to the distinctive role of hegemonic ideologies and group-specific experience in distorting our perceptions and conceptions of the social order. So it's not going to take into account the ways that actually we're influenced by, say, ideology, other social forces, material circumstances, and social relations. Instead, it's going to be this idea that, well, human beings kind of aren't influenced by all those other things in the world. And Mills says, well, if you're going to think of rational agents thinking in this way about principles of justice, they're not going to be able to take account of the way that human beings actually think, the way in which knowledge is constituted for actual human beings in the real world. And finally, the idea of strict compliance. Mills says, finally, some theorists, such as famously John Rawls in A Theory of Justice, also endorse ideal theory in the sense of strict compliance as opposed to partial compliance theory. The examination of the principle of justice that would regulate a well-ordered society. Everyone is presumed to act justly and to do his part in upholding just institutions. And Mills's response is, how does that tell us how we actually get to that ideal of strict or full compliance? How does assuming strict compliance with the principles of justice tell us how we actually achieve strict compliance with the principles of justice? All it tells us is kind of divorced abstractly in some ideal utopian sense what perhaps justice would be if everyone did, let's say, follow the laws or behave morally and so on. But of course the fact is people don't. This leaves Mills to argue that ideal theories really are nothing more than ideologies, because they deleteriously reify forms of hegemony. They end up obfuscating the influences of ideology in the world, of ideological practices, ideological beliefs that perpetuate injustice. Because these things, since they're blocked by the veil of ignorance, they're actually smuggled in, Mills says, through that idea of the idealized moral agent deliberating in the original position. He says, as an ideology, it is a distortional complex of ideas, values, norms, and beliefs that reflects the non-representative interests and experiences of a small minority of the national population, middle to upper class white males, who are hugely overrepresented in the professional philosophical population. So Mills thinks because it isn't accounted for that actually all kinds of unconscious things influence what we think we're rationally formulating. What happens is, in ideal theory itself, it ends up being a representation of the beliefs of people who engage in theorizing. And who are the main people that engage in ideal theorizing? Well, wealthy, kind of ivory tower white men mainly, at least especially in the 1970s. That is going to influence then what is thought about, how to deal with injustice. Whether you should think about injustice first or justice first, and then think about how to address injustice. And Mills thinks this is clear in the fact that for Rawls, he doesn't largely talk about racial injustice. It's assumed that racial injustice could be accounted for generally under justice, and that, well, that's something for non-ideal theory to deal with. But Mills thinks, what if there are peculiar things about racial injustice? That's not being accounted for in ideal theory. So, non-ideal theory, Mills thinks, is better able to attend to the distinctive particular experience of, say, women or non-whites, because it does not assume, for example, full compliance with the principles of justice. It doesn't assume all those 6 characteristics which end up smuggling in all kinds of unconscious values and beliefs that influence the formulation of principles of justice. Non-ideal theory does not essentialize particular experiences. As Mills says, what one wants are abstractions of the idealized descriptive model kind that capture the essentials of the situation of women and non-whites, not abstract away from them. Global concepts like patriarchy and white supremacy arguably fill this role, as Marxism's class society capitalism did, however inadequately for non-class oppressions for earlier generations. These terms are abstractions that do reflect the specificities of group experience, thereby potentially generating categories and principles that illuminate rather than obfuscate the reality of different kinds of subordination. So Mills is pointing out that, well, we actually have concepts that we can say are abstractions, the idea of class or patriarchy, and we can see that the idea of patriarchy or the idea of class tells us in a way what we ought to do to address, let's say, class conflict or class injustice, class exploitation. And it's noticeable that there's not really a mention of class at all in John Rawls's theory of justice. There's no real account of power generally, how power operates. What does that do if you don't account for a power or class conflict or the patriarchy in your theory of justice? Because you say, well, that's actually secondary. Are there some things then you might be overlooking that end up meaning that your theory of justice can end up perpetuating those injustices? Right? Mills thinks, yes, that is the case. One objection that Mills considers to non-ideal theory is that, well, non-ideal theory is already contained in ideal theory, right? Because think about what Rawls says about the distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. They're separate, but they're informed by one another, right? Ideal theory is coming up with ideal principles of justice for the sake of non-ideal theory, and non-ideal theory knows what to do because ideal theory has established what ideal principles of justice are. So non-ideal theory is, going to be able to address injustices because it's informed by ideal theory, and so by way then ideal theory actually is going to address injustices, even if not right away. Mills thinks that's ridiculous, and in rejecting that idea, he uses Susan Moller-Okin and her book Justice, Gender, and the Family as an example. So what Okin does is basically argue against this idea of political philosophy and justice pertaining really to the public sphere, and she wants to show actually we need to get rid of this distinction between the public and the private, and show the ways that a concept of justice should be used in the private sphere as well to address, for example, sexism. Now, Okun ends up in her book saying that she's influenced by Rawls, and although Rawls overlooks this, she thinks Rawls' theory can offer a way through the veil of ignorance to address sexism and injustice in private spheres of life. But Mills thinks actually there's no reason that you had to appeal to Rawls and his ideal theory at all to address sexism. Mills says, summing it all up then, one could say epigrammatically that the best way to bring about the ideal is by recognizing the non-ideal, and that by assuming the ideal or the near ideal, one is only guaranteeing the perpetuation of the non-ideal. That, so to speak, the best way to realize the ideal is to have a full grasp on what the non-ideal is, as to what injustice is actually occurring. And once you know what exactly that injustice is, you know not that, basically. That is what we should overcome. We need to basically dissolve it, transcend it. That you don't need, a veil of ignorance to know that family structure is inegalitarian if you have male as the head of the household, and the woman, the wife, let's say, is relegated to housework only, isn't allowed to work, or things like that. You can just look at the circumstances of the housewife and see the ways in which her desires might be held back. So we can look at injustice, we can look at the non-ideal, Mills says, and we can see that's an injustice. We don't need the ideal of justice to tell us that it's an injustice. Although Mills argues that ideal theory is ideological because it kind of smuggles in these it obfuscates injustice, it obfuscates ideology, and so then smuggles in kind of ideological unconscious beliefs and values. I think it's still worth asking the question, is it possible for an ideal theory to be non-ideological? Is it possible, say, for Rawls's methodology to kind of be informed more by non-ideal circumstances, such that maybe you have more information in the original position? Similarly, I think a question worth asking is it possible for a non-ideal theory to actually be ideological? Is it possible that a non-ideal theory which just wants to locate injustices and overcome them might as well, if it admits, hey, we're influenced by all kinds of ideology in our thinking, is it possible as well that non-ideal theory can unwittingly perpetuate and reify systems of oppression?